What if the masters whose paintings hang in our greatest museums weren't creating art at all? What if they were witnesses? What if every brushstroke, every shadowed archway, every cascading wave of earth frozen on canvas was something far more deliberate than aesthetic choice? This might sound like the premise of a conspiracy theory, but stay with me, because once you see what I'm about to show you, you won't be able to look at a single painting from this era the same way again. Picture this. From the sunny hillsides of Italy to the frostbitten steppes of Russia, across an entire continent, artists who never met, who belonged to different movements, different schools, different philosophies, all painted the same inexplicable scene. Grand structures, ancient and magnificent, half swallowed by earth, not gently aged, not slowly weathered, but violently buried, as though the ground itself had risen up to consume them. Take the work of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, mid-18th century. His engravings of Rome show us a city we wouldn't recognize today. The Pyramid of Cestius, that iconic monument, is depicted sunken deep into the earth. People in his drawings walk at street level, but that level is stories above where the pyramid's base should be. The ground around it ripples and waves like solidified water, like someone poured liquid stone across the landscape and left it to harden where it fell. Fast forward a few decades. A Russian painter named Fyodor Matveev renders his vision of an Italian settlement, and there it is again. The exact same phenomenon. A town perched on a hillside, drowning in streams of hardened clay. You can see it clearly in his work. This substance didn't seep up from below. It flowed down from above, carving paths down slopes, filling streets, burying the lower floors of buildings as it went. In the valleys below, he paints puddles of standing liquid, as if the disaster had only just occurred, as if the earth were still settling. Now, before you dismiss this, before you file it away under artistic license or romantic exaggeration, consider what mainstream historians tell us. They call it the cultural layer, a natural accumulation, they say. Over centuries, dust settles, buildings collapse, debris piles up. The ground level rises gradually, organically. It's geology. It's inevitable. Nothing to see here. But here's where that explanation starts to fracture. Can gradual accumulation explain layers 5, 10, sometimes 15 meters thick? Can it explain why these layers appear to have fallen from above rather than built up from below? Can it explain how massive stone structures are buried to their upper floors while delicate trees nearby remain untouched? Even thriving, the math doesn't work, the physics don't work, and the artists, whether they knew it or not, have left us a record that contradicts every comfortable explanation we've been given. These paintings aren't landscapes, they're evidence, they're crime, scene photographs rendered in oil and watercolor. And if we're willing to examine them not as art critics but as investigators, they reveal details that turn the official story inside out. Look at the people in these paintings. Really look at them. In work after work, you'll find small human figures moving through these devastated landscapes. Historians will tell you these are tourists, curious travelers, romantic wanderers captivated by picturesque ruins. But watch how they move. They're not strolling. They're not admiring the view. They carry long poles, staffs, sometimes what look like walking sticks, and they're using them to probe the ground ahead of every step they take. This is not the behavior of sightseers. This is the behavior of survivors. People who know, from hard experience, that what looks like solid earth beneath their feet might not be solid at all. That the substance they're walking on is still settling, still treacherous, capable of swallowing an unwary traveler. These are officials, investigators, ordinary people trying to comprehend what happened to their world, trying to assess the scale of a disaster that struck so recently the ground hasn't finished drying. And the nature of this disaster, once you understand what you're seeing, is unlike anything in recorded history. This wasn't a flood in any conventional sense. Water rises from below, rivers overflow their banks, seas surge inland, but the pattern is consistent. Low ground floods first, water seeks its level, and when it recedes, it leaves behind silt and debris in predictable layers. What these paintings show is the opposite. The burial came from above. Look at castles perched on hilltops. In canvas after canvas, they're buried from the roof down. Their upper floors, the highest points in the landscape, are covered first. Streams of mud flow down from there, forming massive deposits at the base. In one extraordinary painting by Sokrat Vorobyev, titled Castle on the Seashore, you can actually see the substance falling from the sky, pouring down onto the structure below, blanketing everything in its path. This is why massive stone buildings could be buried to their domes while their interiors remained intact. Water would have filled them from the inside, surged through doors and windows, then drained away. But this was something else entirely, a deluge of semi-solid matter that fell from above like rain. Except it wasn't water, it was earth, clay, a planetary mudflow that came from the sky itself. Here's where it gets even stranger. This clay, this substance that buried entire civilizations, was extraordinarily fertile. The paintings show us something that defies conventional geology. Shortly after the cataclysm, perhaps within years rather than decades, mature trees are already growing from the ruins. Dense shrubs sprout from rooftops. Vegetation erupts from cracks in buried walls. Anyone familiar with actual mudslides or landslides knows what they leave behind. Dead earth, sterile soil. It takes years for anything to grow in the aftermath of such events. But here, the very substance that brought death also catalyzed an explosion of life. The ground that buried these structures was so rich, so laden with nutrients, that it transformed ruins into gardens almost overnight. The geographical scope of this phenomenon is staggering. This isn't isolated to one region or one artist's peculiar vision. Under Italian sun, Piranesi documents buried monuments. In the lithographs of Napoleon Orda, we see destroyed fortresses across Belarus and Ukraine, their foundations lost beneath waves of sediment. Vasily Vereshchagin paints mausoleums in Samarkand, half consumed by earth. Different continents, different climates, different cultures, but the signature is identical everywhere. Impact from above, massive volumes of clay, and survivors picking through what remains. This couldn't have been a localized earthquake. It couldn't have been a single volcanic eruption. The pattern repeats across thousands of miles, with frightening consistency. We're looking at something global, an event that reshaped the surface of entire continents in a geological instant. And 19th century artists, working with what we now recognize as documentary precision, captured it all. Now, a skeptic would say these are just paintings, artistic interpretation, romantic fascination with ruins. And I'd agree with that skepticism, except for one thing. There's a place where you can still see this evidence today, not on canvas, not in a museum, but buried in the earth itself, exactly as these artists depicted it. I'm talking about a location in Uzbekistan, an ancient city called Kunya-Urgench, situated at a crossroads of the Silk Road. Here, the evidence isn't rendered in oil paint. It's baked into clay and bone and stone. It's physical. It's irrefutable. And it tells precisely the same story. The first thing that strikes you about Kunya-Urgench is its fortress walls. These aren't ordinary defensive structures. They're cyclopean, monumental, built from countless baked clay bricks, engineered with a sophistication that required immense knowledge and labor. The walls themselves are up to 5 meters thick. 5 meters. That's over 16 feet of solid brick. Now ask yourself, what force could destroy something like that? The southern section looks like something tore chunks out of it, not the careful, targeted damage of siege engines or artillery, but massive, chaotic destruction. Official history mentions battles, assaults, primitive cannons, but be honest with yourself. What battering ram could breach a 16-foot thick wall of fired brick? Even a modern tank would struggle with that task. The destruction isn't localized like cannonball impacts. It's sweeping, catastrophic, as though the city were struck by an elemental force of inhuman power. But the walls, as impressive and damaged as they are, aren't the real evidence. The proof that changes everything is in the substance itself, the clay. At the base of these ancient walls, compressed into thick geological layers, you'll find something that destroys the cultural layer theory forever. Human bones, not in graves, not in cemeteries. Just fragments of wrists, shin bones, pieces of people embedded directly into the stratified clay as though they were fossils from the Mesozoic era. They're arranged chaotically, no order, no burial patterns, just scattered remains that point to a single, horrifying conclusion. These people were caught by surprise, completely, utterly by surprise. This mass of clay and mud didn't slowly accumulate over an abandoned city. It crashed down on a living, thriving population. It buried them alive, instantly. This wasn't the aftermath of a battle. This was the battle. Humanity versus an element they couldn't comprehend, couldn't fight, couldn't survive. The people whose bones are gradually being exposed by wind and rain weren't casualties of war. They were casualties of a cataclysm that turned an entire city into a mass grave in moments. These bones are smoking gun evidence. They prove that what the artists documented thousands of kilometers away wasn't metaphor or exaggeration. It was a deadly physical reality that swept across the known world. And now that we have physical proof, bones embedded in geological strata, we can say with certainty, this happened. The map of this catastrophe extends far beyond Uzbekistan. To truly grasp its scale, we need to turn to another documentarian. In the 19th century, an artist and composer named Napoleon Orda traveled through lands we now call Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine. His lithographs aren't romantic fantasies. They're forensic reports, methodical, precise, almost clinical in their attention to detail. In his work, we see the same themes repeated: the Mir Castle, the Kravo Castle, the Ostrog Castle. Dozens of monumental structures rendered as majestic ruins, drowning in enormous heaps of sand and clay. What remains of their former glory are battered walls. Roofs that survived look as though they endured a bombardment from above, what contemporaries described as a hailstorm of unimaginable violence. Look at the skies in Orda's drawings. Many have a distinctive reddish tint, as though dust and clay still hang suspended in the atmosphere, as though the air itself hasn't cleared from whatever happened. Life goes on, yes. Trees grow, water flows, but the overall impression is unmistakable. This is a world recovering from trauma. But there's one detail in Orda's work that elevates our investigation to an entirely new level. One contrast so shocking, it demands explanation. Next to these cyclopean ruins, whose walls seem built by giants, we see tiny, almost primitive houses, humble dwellings that huddle against the ancient stones like children seeking shelter. These are two different worlds existing in the same space and time. On one side, the legacy of a highly advanced civilization capable of engineering feats that still stagger us today. On the other side, survivors, people who've lost the knowledge, the technology, the organizational capacity of whoever came before. People building simple homes in the shadow of incomprehensible grandeur, sometimes literally attaching their sheds to ancient walls because they can't replicate them. It's as if one civilization was erased from existence, and the few who remained, stripped of their ancestors' achievements, started over from almost nothing, building a new, simpler world on top of the bones of the old. This is where an even darker hypothesis begins to form. Looking at these images, at this pattern of destruction, you start to feel that it wasn't random. It wasn't blind natural fury. The targeting seems too precise. The mudflows appear to have selectivity, seeking out centers of power, knowledge, authority, castles, fortresses, administrative complexes, monumental architecture. Simple villages might have survived, but the grand structures, the seats of the previous civilization, had to be buried, hidden, erased from the landscape as though someone or something wanted to eliminate all traces of what came before. What we see today in these paintings might only be what the destroyers failed to hide completely. Structures too massive to bury entirely, gradually exposed again by rain and erosion. So, where does this leave us? We're looking at evidence of a global event that swept from the Mediterranean to Central Asia to Eastern Europe. An event that annihilated a highly developed civilization and left behind scattered survivors who had to rebuild human society almost from scratch. And the nature of this destruction suggests intent, purpose, design. But what force could orchestrate something like this? What technology could produce flows of clay from the sky? What power could selectively erase entire cities and cultures from the face of the planet? The answer might be encoded in the most disturbing images the artists left us. Images that depict not just the aftermath, but the moment of impact itself. Remember Vorobyov's painting, the one showing substance falling from the sky onto a castle? It's not rain, it's not snow, it's something dense, tangible, material, but there are even more explicit depictions. The work of Konstantin Bogaevsky. His paintings aren't landscapes, they're frozen apocalypses. One of his works carries a title that should make your blood run cold, The Star Wormwood. In it, we see a city simultaneously flooded by streams of mud and illuminated by a brilliant flash emanating from a single point. Bogaevsky didn't just paint the destruction, he painted its cause. This isn't lightning. This isn't a natural phenomenon. It's an explosion. His brushstrokes convey matter flying outward in all directions, a shockwave obliterating everything in its path. The title itself is a direct reference to biblical prophecy. The book of Revelation speaks of a star called wormwood that falls from heaven and poisons the waters of the earth. Was Bogaevsky trying to tell us something? Was he suggesting this catastrophe had cosmic origins? Or something even more terrifying, human origins? Weapons of such destructive power that their effects could only be described in apocalyptic terms? This interpretation finds an eerie echo in Russian folklore. The poet Maximilian Voloshin wrote of a legendary city called Kitezh, which according to myth sank into the waters of Lake Svetloyar to escape invaders. The legend says only the pure of heart can hear its bells ringing beneath the waves or see its reflection in the water. A beautiful story. Except when you look at Lake Svetloyar itself, something doesn't add up. The lake has an almost perfectly circular shape, geometrically regular, and it's unusually deep for the surrounding terrain, with characteristics completely atypical for natural lakes in that region. Its outline is frighteningly similar to an impact crater, the kind left by massive explosions. What if the legend of Kitezh isn't legend at all? What if it's a folk memory, distorted by time, of a real event? What if a great city did stand on that site, but it didn't sink into water? What if it was destroyed by an explosion so powerful it left a perfectly round crater that eventually filled with groundwater? And those bells supposedly ringing from beneath the surface, what if that's a phantom memory of the sound itself? The roar that shook the earth when the weapon detonated? Maybe we're looking at evidence of a war, a conflict waged by a previous civilization using weapons whose destructive capacity seems fantastical to us. Weapons that left scars on the planet in the form of perfectly circular lakes, explosions, streams of clay from the heavens, buried cities, annihilated populations. All these seemingly unconnected pieces, the paintings, the bones in Kunya-Urgench, the ruins across Europe, the legend of Kitezh, they converge into a single, unified picture. A picture of a world that survived warfare or targeted strikes using technology we don't understand. And this picture completely contradicts everything we've been taught about the peaceful, progressive 19th century. So, now we stand at the culmination of our investigation. We've gone from vague suspicions to concrete, disturbing conclusions. Step by step, fragment by fragment, we've assembled a mosaic that challenges the foundational narrative of our history. Let's review the chain of evidence we've built and recognize its undeniable weight. It began in art galleries. Dozens of 19th century artists, seemingly working independently, all painting identical scenes. Cities buried under clay that fell from above. We saw figures with poles probing treacherous ground, and recognized them not as tourists, but as survivors. We saw vegetation erupting from ruins, and understood the substance that brought death was also unnaturally fertile. These paintings became our first critical evidence, silent testimony from an era that couldn't speak directly. But art can be dismissed, fantasy, imagination, metaphor, until it finds physical corroboration. The evidence at Kunya-Urgench provided exactly that. Walls 5 meters thick, destroyed by inexplicable force. And crucially, human remains embedded directly into geological strata. These bones cry out across centuries that the catastrophe was real, sudden, and universally deadly. This isn't a cultural layer. This is a mass grave on a civilizational scale. With that confirmation, we could expand our map. The works of Napoleon Orda and others showed the destruction stretched from Central Asia to the heart of Europe. Everywhere, the same pattern. Megalithic ruins of a sophisticated civilization, side by side with primitive dwellings of a post-catastrophe world. This wasn't localized. This was a global cataclysm that drew a line between eras, erasing one entirely, and forcing the next to start almost from zero. And finally, we identified a possible mechanism. Bogaevsky's paintings showing explosive flashes. The star wormwood. The legend of Kitezh and Lake Svetloyar with its crater-like geometry, all pointing not to blind natural disaster, but to the consequences of warfare or targeted strikes using weapons of staggering power. Standing on these ruins, on this evidence, we're left with the fundamental questions. Who were they? These masters of stone whose cyclopean works still defy our engineering capabilities. What technologies did they possess? What knowledge systems? Why was their legacy so thoroughly, systematically buried and erased from memory? And what really happened in that supposedly quiet, genteel 19th century that forced the world to reset itself and begin history anew? Official history offers neat answers, linear progress, simple explanations, comfortable narratives, but it's riddled with gaps, with questions that go unasked because the answers might be too uncomfortable. Perhaps the truth is stranger, more complex, more terrifying than any fiction. It's not written in approved textbooks, but its echoes persist in old legends. Its scars show through the earth, and it stares back at us from darkened canvases, waiting for someone to finally see what the artists recorded. The truth isn't something we're given. It's something we have to excavate ourselves, learning to observe, to question, to analyze, and most importantly, to ask the questions that official narratives don't want us to ask.